Hey there, Liberty fam, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you are looking for a laugh today because boy oh boy do I have a good one. You probably remember the Illinois gun ban that I first covered in this video and then covered again in this update. Short version is it designates most guns as assault blah blah blahs and then bans them for being assault blah blah blahs and bans mags over 12 rounds because they're high capacity assault blah blah blahs. The original bill was written into an amendment of a bill about slides at amusement parks. And yes, I am 100% serious, and yes, it passed because that's how government works. The law is already facing legal challenges at the state level, and there are also lawsuits going after enforcement of local bans that mimic the state law. One such lawsuit calls on Highland Park, a suburb of Chicago, to defend their ban, and boy is their argument something else. Alright guys, I am interrupting the details of this story because I want to give a personal shout out to Fold AR. When I get support from folks in the 2A world, I try to always give them a shout out in a video that matches up with what they stand for, and honestly, I cannot think of a better video for Fold AR than this one. They're a veteran-owned and operated company out of Texas that designs and produces all of the parts and components for the one and only folding barrel AR. Yes, an AR that literally folds for concealment and storage. It is probably one of the coolest things that I have personally ever heard of. So, Second Amendment and Liberty approved. So again, thank you very, very much to the folks over at Fold AR for supporting the channel. Now back to the story. The foundation of their defense is that semi-auto guns aren't protected under the Second Amendment because they weren't in common use when the Constitution was written. And I'm sure they typed that out on computers, communicated via email, and stopped on their lunch break to read Twitter. Their argument, written out with the help of Brady attorneys, is a purposeful misinterpretation of both Bruen and Heller. Highland Park argues that there isn't even a question of constitutionality with their ban because they're not going after protected arms. I don't know how I'm going to get through this one with a straight face, but we're going to give it a shot. Their defense in National Association of Gun Rights v. Highland Park is that while Bruen said governments have to take history into account, the Supreme Court didn't define what history, how to take it into account, and haven't defined common use. Bless their hearts. So the anti-gunners think that they're being clever with some bizarre, almost literal interpretation. It would be cute if it wasn't so scary. Here's a direct quote from their brief. The Supreme Court has not specified how legislatures and courts are to determine whether a modern weapon is in common use. The court said that handguns, America's most popular firearm, are in common use today. But plaintiffs, National Association of Gun Rights, do not suggest that the assault weapons at issue, primarily AR-15 style assault weapons, are as commonly used as handguns. Because everything has to be as common as a Glock 19 to count, apparently. Instead, they assert that these weapons must be considered in common use because the number of AR-15 rifles and other modern sporting rifles in circulation in the United States exceeds 24 million. That is not sufficient to carry their burden. Plaintiff's statistic does not address the question that Heller and Bruen require plaintiffs to answer. Hold up. I thought that the point of Bruen was for governments to have to answer this history question, not the gun rights groups. But continue. The number of weapons in circulation merely counts the number of such weapons produced or imported into the country, less exports. This figure, which presumably includes weapons in the possession of law enforcement agencies and criminals, and those on store shelves or in warehouses, is almost certainly an overestimation of the number of weapons lawfully possessed by civilians. The number also says nothing about the frequency with which these weapons are used for lawful purposes. So their argument is that despite the fact that the AR-15 platform is the most commonly sold style of gun in the country, that fact is irrelevant because some of the rifles are still in shop inventory, some are bought by police departments, and some might be owned by criminals illegally. And this is supposed to be a big gotcha moment, I guess? If we already know that it's the most commonly sold rifle platform in the country, there is absolutely a way to get a rough number of how many are owned by everyday law-abiding citizens, but okay. And their claim that no one knows how often they're used for legal purposes, well, let's consider for a moment FBI stats of how many crimes are committed with rifles every year, usually only a couple hundred, and subtract that from the millions of rifles in the US. That's how often rifles, not being used to hurt anybody, are used for lawful purposes. The math is actually pretty simple, lawyer man. Or maybe lawyer woman. I guess I just assumed their gender. Must be because I'm an evil gun owner. I mean, if a lowly little YouTuber like myself can punch holes in your legal argument, it's a bad argument. They continue, even starting with this inflated number, this lone statistic does not carry plaintiff's burden. Heller and Bruin command an approach rooted in history. The court relied on the historical understanding of the Second Amendment to demark the limits on the exercise of that right. According to the historical approach, the general meaning of the Second Amendment is fixed, but also applies to new circumstances. In other words, courts must extract general principles or definitions from the historical understanding and then apply them to modern weapons and circumstances. Yes, like the way free speech applies to movies, telephones, and the internet. The common use rule emerges from that historical understanding. That is, the Supreme Court has declared that weapons in common use at the time of the founding are protected by the Second Amendment. At a minimum, the Supreme Court's historical approach indicates that a modern weapon can be considered in common use only if it is as commonly used as weapons that the Second Amendment protected at the time of the founding. Pretty sure that's not the argument in Bruin, but let's go with it. First, there was already a court ruling striking down the Massachusetts stun gun ban. Massachusetts tried arguing that stun guns were dangerous and unusual and could be banned because they weren't around in 1791. The Supreme Court in 2016 said, nope, that's a violation of Heller and the Second Amendment. Now, I obviously haven't been to law school, and I'm not a lawyer, but I feel like if their job is to argue gun cases, they have to know this. I don't think anyone thinks of lawyers as being an overly honest profession, but this is obvious and deliberate intellectual dishonesty. Second, if we want to go with their stupid literal interpretation, fine. They want to argue that modern sporting rifles weren't as common as arms when the Constitution was written. The U.S. population in 1790 was 3.9 million. For the most part, only whites were allowed to own guns, so let's assume all 813,000 white men, 16 and older, owned a musket. We'll even throw in a few of the folks under 16 and round it up to an even million. Turns out that that's about a quarter of the population, and according to Gallup polls, over a quarter of American households own a gun. And most of these households own AR-15s. As they mention in their own brief, the number of sporting rifles in the U.S. is over 20 million. 3 million were sold to law-abiding Americans in 2020 alone. If people own more than 20 million of something, it certainly isn't a rare oddity. Third, they defeat their own argument. Follow along with this one. They say that guns are only protected if they're as common as certain arms back in the 1790s. But also note how they said specifically that the Supreme Court affirmed that handguns are considered common use. Well, Brady, handguns were not in common use in 1790, at least not to the level as muskets, so that one's out the window. Their final point ignores that assault rifles are capable of full auto by the actual technical definition and are thus banned for civilian use without lots of cash and ATF permission. NAGR makes this point and Highland Park counters. The fact that fully automatic weapons are banned by federal law, as plaintiffs point out, does not mean that weapons dissimilar to them in any respect may not be banned. The Supreme Court has also upheld a ban on short-barreled shotguns, which also cannot fire multiple rounds with a single pull of the trigger. How many people outside of the new brace rule really own short barrel shotguns. Why is that even brought up here? The difference in trigger mechanism is immaterial compared to what does matter, whether semi-automatic weapons are unusually dangerous. The evidence is clear that they are. Indeed, semi-automatic weapons are, in fact, even more lethal than fully automatic weapons. So now their argument isn't even that assault weapons are especially dangerous and need to be banned, but all semi-autos, including an entire class of rifle that is no more powerful than your everyday hunting rifle. Also including most of the aforementioned and protected handguns in the US, which they themselves acknowledged. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what we are up against. When folks comment on pending bills and legislation and say, well, they can't do that because the Constitution and Bruin, this is what I'm going to show them. They can and they will, and this is the kind of garbage they're going to use to gunk up the courts while gun owners have to sit and wait it out. We're seeing it in New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California, which cited literal Jim Crow as historical context, by the way, and federally with the ATF. And sure, no justice worth their mustard would ever allow this a full send, but folks act like Democrats won't ever try to pack the courts. And that is why gun owners need to be forever vigilant. If these folks think the Constitution is just a piece of paper, they're gonna think the same thing about Bruin. It is an entirely different framework with an entirely different rule set, and gun owners need to realize that. And that's all I have to say about that. So that is it for this video. Please like, share, and subscribe if you are new here. Please, as well, vote for me in the Gundies if you think I deserve it. For the top voices of the 2A category, you get to vote every single day until the end of the month. Anyways, as always, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there, my blue state friends, and happy shooting.